Today we're going to be talking about self-awareness and specifically emotional self-awareness. At the heart of this lecture is something that I like to call the tiny little brain hypothesis, and you'll hear me talk about this throughout the course. But essentially the tiny little brain hypothesis says that the world is infinitely complicated and complex, and that our brains are very, very tiny. And so we are always struggling to understand what is going on in the world around us because it's just simply too complicated for us to really understand in a meaningful way. And so what we end up doing is focusing on one tiny part of the picture. And we're only ever seeing one tiny part of everything that is going on, and we're using information from that zoomed in piece to make conjectures or guesses, and those guesses are often inaccurate. So basically, world is very complex, brains are very tiny, it's hard to really see what's going on. Well, just like the external world is infinitely complicated and complex, our internal world is infinitely complicated and complex as well. For example, you probably take for granted the fact that you have a tiny little person that lives in your head and they're talking all day long, just like thought, 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 and they're telling you their opinion on just about everything. In addition to that, just like we have this stream of consciousness, these stream of thoughts that are going through our mind, we also have a stream of emotions. So throughout the day, you are always feeling something. At any given time, you are feeling something, and you can check in on that stream of emotions if you want to. I think people seem to be more aware of their internal monologue and less aware of their, like when you tell people they have a constant stream of emotions throughout the day, they're like, oh, really? But yes, you do. And to make it even more complicated, this stream of thought and this stream of emotions, they affect one another. So your thoughts influence your feelings influence your thoughts. And to make it even more complicated, we not only have thoughts, we have thoughts about our thoughts. So we say, oh, this is a good thought or this is a bad thought. I like this thought. I don't like this thought. We have thoughts about our thoughts, and we have feelings about our feelings. We get guilty when we get angry at someone we love, or we get stressed out at people, and then we get frustrated at how much stress we're having. So this is your internal mind at any point in time, and just like the external world is infinitely complicated, your internal world is infinitely complicated as well. And so just like with the external world, we're only ever seeing a little bubble, the same is true of our internal world. We're only aware of a small percentage of what actually is going on in the complicated person that you are. Throughout the lecture, you're also going to hear me use this term non-conscious. And by non-conscious, I just mean everything that's going on outside of that little circle of awareness. Many people have this like Freudian idea of the unconscious, where it's this like nefarious part of yourself lurking in the shadows, trying to trick you into doing bad things or punish you. That is not what I mean by non-conscious. By non-conscious, I simply mean all of those thoughts and feelings that are going on outside of this little bubble of awareness. I teach undergraduate students public speaking, and they're really nervous a lot of times when they go up to give their presentation, and they might like sway back and forth, or clasping and rubbing their hands, using a ton of crutch words. And you talk to them afterwards, and you're like, oh, do you know they were doing this thing? And they had no idea, right? You can even show them a video of themselves doing it, and they're like, oh, I was doing that? That's what I mean by non-conscious. It's just those behaviors, those thoughts, those feelings that are outside of our current, present conscious awareness. Okay, so we have our little bubble here, and that bubble is what self-awareness is. This bubble that you see on the screen, that's what I mean by self-awareness. It's those aspects of your internal world that fit into that little circle of awareness. Now, ironically, what happens when we get really emotional is that bubble shrinks. The more emotional we are, the smaller that bubble of awareness is. And you know this. You've been in a situation where you've been so angry that you cannot see past your own anger, that everything you think and feel and do is subsumed in that anger. And that's what happens. The more emotional we get, the more that self-awareness, that little bubble of awareness, shrinks in and focuses. So it's most important to be aware of yourself when you're more emotional. And when we talk about self-regulation strategies going forward, you have to be aware that your awareness is so limited. So the goal for self-awareness is to make that bubble as large as possible, to get you to be aware of your own internal life to the full extent that you can, to be aware of your thoughts and your feelings throughout the day, and your thoughts and your feelings in reaction to your thoughts and your feelings, and to be aware of this complex internal world that you have. This is self-awareness. It's kind of this like all-seeing eye of what's going on inside of you, and it's aware of things without getting caught up in them. There is a difference between being incredibly angry and being caught up in that, and being incredibly angry and being aware of that. And it's a subtle difference, but it's a really powerful one. And that's what self-awareness is. It's being aware of those emotions, being aware of your thoughts without getting caught up in them. Self-awareness is the fundamental skill upon which all social and emotional skills build. So the purpose is a leadership course, and when I think of leadership, I think of successful social interactions. That's how I really think about leadership, successful social interactions. And the heart of successful social interactions is self-awareness. That if you're going to be able to deal effectively with other people, you have to be aware of your own emotions first. So here's a roadmap for today. We're going to start out by talking about emotions and what they are. Then we're going to differentiate between emotions, traits, and moods. So we will start out by talking about emotions themselves. There are 4 points about emotions that we're going to cover. First, we'll talk about emotions being value-laden somatic experiences, and I'll explain what I mean by that. I'll encourage you guys to experience the full emotional spectrum, to develop a rich emotional vocabulary, and then lastly, we'll talk about the difference between judgments and emotions, because people often get them confused. So let's start out by talking about what emotions are. So there actually is no scientific consensus on a definition for emotion. I think this really shows the shortcomings of psychology as a science, that there is this experience that is so fundamental to what it means to be a human, and it's so intuitive. We can all think about it and talk about it, and yet to scientifically define it is almost impossible. So I've come up with a few definitions that I've borrowed and made up on my own that I like. Feel free to come up with whatever definition works the best for you. The first definition I like is that emotions are value-laden somatic experiences. Let's break down that definition a little bit. Somatic just means in your body. It means physical. So by a somatic experience, I mean that you have a physical sensation that is associated with emotions. And value-laden just means that we think of it as good or bad. So a value-laden somatic experience means that we have emotions that we experience physically in our body, and we have a reaction to those feelings. They're either good feelings or bad feelings. The other definition I really like is that emotions are sensory perceptions of our social world. Just in the same way that our eye detects light waves and gives us information about our physical world, emotions are information about our social world, about how we're interacting with other people. So that's another really useful way to think about emotions. They give us information about our relationships with other people. There's also, you may have heard that there's like a fundamental number of emotions that are universal to all people. Again, there's a lot of argument about whether that's true and what they are and how many they are. Some psychologists feel that it's just two. That there are basically two emotions. You're either happy or sad, and everything is some variation of that. So fear, anger, those would all be part of the sadness, the bad emotions category. Happiness, joy, excitement would be part of the good emotional category, and that's it. It's one or the other. You're probably familiar with this structure that was used in Inside Out. This is actually a popular psychological theory that there are 5 basic emotions: sadness, fear, anger, disgust, and joy. Again, there's no consensus on this, so come up with your own idea about what are the fundamental emotions, and whatever seems right to you can be right for you. So that's what emotions are. They are value-laden somatic experiences. Next, I'm going to encourage you to experience the full emotional spectrum. We learn from a very young age that some emotions are good and that some emotions are bad. So when we're young, when we're smiling and we're laughing, we receive a lot of praise and attention for that. It's like we're a good child. When we're sad, when we're angry, when we cry and scream, we're told that's bad. We're a bad child, right? And because of that, we end up truncating our own emotional experience. We cut off certain emotions, the conscious experience of certain emotions, because we don't like that we have those. We don't like being angry with the people that we love. We don't like being scared. And so we cut those things off, and when we experience them, we don't really pay attention to it. And we don't like to admit experiencing those things. In Buddhism, they have this thing called the second arrow, and it comes from a story where the Buddha is talking to his disciples, and he says, "Hey guys, does it suck to get shot with an arrow?" And they're like, "Yeah, Buddha, that sucks." And he's like, "Well, does it suck more to get shot with 2 arrows?" And they were like, "Yeah, Buddha, that sucks even more." And he was like, "Well, why do you keep doing it to yourselves?" And what he meant by that is that we often have an emotional reaction that we cannot control, and then we get upset at ourselves for having that emotional reaction. Let me give you an example. When I was in grad school, I was applying for jobs at the same time as one of my best friends, and we were applying for the same job, so we were in direct competition with each other. And she got a call back for an interview before I did. And she's so excited and happy about this, and when she's telling me, and just the first thing I feel is envious. I just have this gut reaction of just pure envy, where it's like, why did she get a call back and I didn't? And I wanted that, right? And then after the envy, I felt guilt that why was I feeling this way? This is one of my best friends. I should be happy for her. I shouldn't feel envious. So I feel guilty about that, right? And then, I get angry at myself for feeling guilty, because it's like, well, I'm allowed to be a little bit envious. And what you do is you wind up with emotions built on emotions built on emotions, whereas you could stop that right there and say, okay, I'm envious. That's a normal human reaction to this. I'm not going to act on it. I'm not going to sabotage her. But there's nothing wrong with being envious. That doesn't make me a bad person. I don't need to feel guilty for being envious. I don't need to be angry at myself for feeling guilty. And instead of building emotions on top of each other, we can just address the real emotion that's there, which is envy. But you have to be willing, you have to be open to experiencing the full spectrum of emotions to be able to do that. When you experience envy, you have to say, okay, this is part of the emotional experience of a human being. I'm not going to feel good or bad about having that emotional experience. Just like if you ate candy all day, every day, you would get sick of it, right? That we can't just always eat sweet. We want sour sometimes, or bitter, or spicy, that it is using the full palette of our taste that makes food enjoyable and delicious. Life is the same way, that if we try to stay in this always happy, always pleasant, emotional experience, that we're going to get bored of that, we're going to get sick of it. It's not healthy. In order to have this rich emotional life, yeah, we want the sweet parts, but we also need to be open to the bitter parts, the sour parts, the spicy parts. That's what's going to make our emotional life as rich and joyful as a good meal. So we've talked about emotions being value-laden somatic experiences. I've encouraged you to experience the full spectrum of emotions. The next thing we're going to talk about is developing a rich emotional vocabulary. Most of us lack a deep emotional vocabulary. Like, we kind of walk around with this like Frankenstein approach to emotions, like I'm angry, I'm sad, and we're limited to a few number of emotional words that we use to describe ourselves, which is really silly because, as we all know, emotions are incredibly nuanced and complex and complicated. So I encourage you to paint with a rich emotional palette. If you were trying to draw a picture of the ocean to someone who's never seen it before, and there's, you know, the bright orange sun and the deep blue sea and the yellow sand and the black and white seagulls and everything else, and you're trying to communicate that to them in just black and white, and they've never seen the ocean before, they're gonna miss so much of that information, right? They're gonna miss so much of the experience. And when we only have a few very basic words to describe our emotions to other people, that's the same thing that happens. They get this very blunted, black and white, limited version of our internal experience. So I encourage you to develop a rich emotional vocabulary. There's lots of different ways you can do that. One of my favorite ways is using these emotion wheels, where it starts out with these like kind of more foundational emotions in the middle, and then it has all these different variations of them as you go out from the circle. And I had a student once who, she pinned this up in her office, and she said every time she got upset, she would come and like pick out which emotion it was and then go through and find the most kind of nuanced description of what she was feeling. And she said she really enjoyed that because it helped her understand her own emotions better, right? That she was able to really pinpoint what kind of emotional experience she was having. Let me give you a few examples. We use the word guilty and ashamed. We use those words pretty interchangeably, and yet they mean very different things. Guilty is a personal experience. Guilty is when you feel as if you have violated your own sense of right and wrong, whereas ashamed is when you feel embarrassed in front of other people. You feel like you violated society's idea of right and wrong. Even if you feel personally that the action was not bad, everyone else looks down upon it. That's shame. Jealousy and envy, we tend to use these words interchangeably as well, but they have very different meanings, as this meme will help me communicate. Jealousy, or we'll start with envy. Envy is when you want something that someone else has. So he is envious of whoever is dating this girl. He wants something that they have. Jealousy is when we're afraid of losing something that we already have. So she is experiencing jealousy. He's envious. He wants something that someone else has. She's jealous. She's worried about losing something that she has. So again, there's subtle differences in these words, and yet we use them interchangeably. We overlook that nuance in emotional experience. One of the reasons it's so important to develop a rich emotional vocabulary is that it allows us to express ourselves more accurately, more powerfully to other people. We can communicate to other people what our internal experience is, and that is a really important and useful skill. The other thing is that it helps us understand other people's internal states better. That we, when they tell us they're angry, we can be like, well, are you livid or are you furious? And obviously that's an exaggeration. You wouldn't want to do that. But when we have a rich emotional vocabulary, we can help parse out what other people are feeling and really help drill down. And so this rich emotional vocabulary allows us more insight into ourselves. It allows us to communicate better with other people, and it allows us to understand other people. So it's a really important emotional skill. So far, we've talked about how emotions are value-laden somatic experiences. I've encouraged you to experience the full emotional spectrum and to develop a rich emotional vocabulary. The last thing we're going to talk about is making sure not to confuse judgments and emotions, which seems obvious, but people mix them up pretty often. Couples especially have this thing where they'll go to couples therapy and their therapist will tell them to express their emotions more. And they'll be like, okay, I feel like John is a jerk. And they'll put feel in front of it, and this magically makes it an emotion. And you're supposed to share your emotion. So it's actually good for the relationship to say that you feel like your partner is a jerk, right? That is not an emotion. That is a judgment. Emotions are self-focused. They're about what's going on with you as a person, what's going on internally. Judgments are other focused. They're focused on evaluating another person or their behavior. So let me give you some examples and we'll talk about how to tell the difference. I feel like you never keep your promises. This is being expressed as a feeling, right? I feel like you never keep your promises. Well, the way we can check whether it's actually a feeling or whether it's a judgment is to replace I feel with I think. I think that you never keep your promises. That's still a sensical sentence. So that means that it's a judgment. If you can swap I feel with I think, then it's a judgment. The emotion that is associated with this might be something like, I'm scared. You don't keep your promises. I can't depend on you. That scares me. I'm scared that I can't depend on you being there for me when you say that you will. That's the emotion. So I feel like you never keep your promises. That's about the other person. That's about their behavior. The emotion is about you and what's going on internally. And you can see by looking at this why we are so eager to give judgments and so hesitant to talk about our feelings. The judgments are all about the other person. The emotion is about you, and when it's about you and your needs, and when you share your emotions in that way, it's a very vulnerable position to be in. And so we often find it easier and much more comfortable to judge other people and their behavior than to share our own emotions. So we talked about emotions themselves. We described emotions as value-laden somatic experiences. I encourage you to experience the full emotional spectrum and to develop a rich emotional vocabulary. And then also told you to be careful about confusing judgments, which are centered on other people, and emotions, which are about ourselves and our own internal state. We just finished talking about emotions and how those are value-laden somatic experiences. Next, we're going to talk about the difference between traits, moods, and emotions. Emotions are powerful physiological experiences that last a few moments. Traits are lifelong predispositions that reflect the type, frequency, and intensity of emotion. And moods are lower intensity emotional echoes. We've already talked about emotions a lot today, so I'm not going to harp on it too much right now, but the main thing to take away here is that emotions are powerful, that they have a physical effect on us that is quite powerful, but it's also short-lived, that the intense emotional experience usually only lasts less than 5 minutes. Traits are lifelong dispositions that reflect the type, frequency, and intensity of emotions that we experience. So essentially, people with certain traits are more likely to experience certain emotions than other people. So when we talked about traits earlier in the semester, we talked about positive and negative affectivity, that people just are born with a natural set point of how much positive and how much negative emotion they tend to experience. So that is something that will influence your emotional experience. And neuroticism is another example. So people high in neuroticism have more powerful emotional reactions. They have just more emotions than people lower on neuroticism. They're more emotionally reactive to their surroundings. They're more given to depression, anxiety, negative emotions like that. So people who are high on neuroticism are more likely to experience more intense emotions and more negative emotions. And that's consistent across the lifespan, right? That tends to be consistent from a young age to an old age. Moods are like emotions, but they're much less intense and they last a lot longer. A mood usually starts with an emotion that kind of diffuses, and moods can last hours, days, months, and even years. There was a year where it was like a rough year for me. I was really struggling with my research and getting publications out. And then at the same time as this was going on, my girlfriend's father was dying. And it was just a really difficult, the year leading up to that and the year after that, it was just 2 really hard years for me. And about a year after he passed away, and things had kind of returned to normal a little bit, I was having like a really good day, and I was like in a happy mood, and I was like, oh, like it just occurred to me that I'd been in a bad mood for like 2 years, and I'd gotten so used to it that I hadn't even noticed, right? And so moods can last that long. It can be this predisposition for years. Sometimes they last a morning, sometimes they last years. And I think one of the hardest things about being an adult that no one tells you as a kid is that you're going to have good decades and you're going to have bad decades. Sometimes you look back and you're just like, man, that was a rough 10 years. Didn't come together just like I would have wanted. And that those things can really have a powerful emotional impact on you. Moods prime us towards specific emotional reactions. So, I mean, that's essentially what a mood is. When you're in a good mood, it's really easy to make you laugh, to make you smile, to get you engaged with people. When you're in a bad mood, you're just kind of like prepped and ready to go, looking for an argument, looking for a reason to be angry or sad. So moods predispose us to react in certain ways to the world around us. A lot of the common psychological disorders, when we think of psychological disorders, we're usually referring to mood disorders. So generalized anxiety disorder is a mood disorder. Depression is a mood disorder. It's when you're just constantly being prepped to emotionally react in a certain way, in a way that becomes really maladaptive to your life. So far, we've talked about emotions and how they are powerful physiological experiences, value-laden. We've differentiated between emotions, which are very fast, last usually less than 5 minutes, versus traits, which is an emotional predisposition across the lifespan, and moods, which can last hours, days, or even years. Next, we're going to talk about the effect of emotions, which include thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, how emotions influence these things, and thus how we can gain insight into our emotions by paying attention to these things. So thoughts present themselves to us in a language we easily understand, right? Our thoughts are usually in our native language. Sometimes we have thoughts as like pictures and images, but it's usually pretty concrete. We can understand it verbally in a way that we cannot with feelings. It's not like you get really angry and a little sign pops up and goes anger, or you get really excited and it's like excitement. We have to interpret our feelings, and they're very subjective by their nature. They're subjective, they're abstract, they're messy. And so one way we can understand our feelings is by paying attention to how our feelings influence our thoughts, our physical feelings, and our behaviors. So let's understand emotions a little bit and where they come from. Pretend I'm walking out in the Serengeti like I do all the time, and I see a lion. And I see this lion, and my body immediately responds. So my heart starts beating really quickly, my hands start sweating, I start breathing really fast. And then my mind notices this physical feeling. My mind goes, my heart's beating really quickly, my hands are sweating, I'm breathing really quickly. Something physically is going on with me. And so I scan the environment to figure out what is causing this. And I see the lion, and I go, okay, I'm feeling this powerful physical experience, and I see a lion, so it must be fear. That emotion that I'm experiencing must be fear. And I'm going to run away. And so we have here the feeling, the physical sensation of being scared, the thought of interpreting that, the thought that is associated with that feeling, and then the behavior. Now, if instead of a lion, I see Natalie Portman, I'm going to have a similar physical response, right? My heart's going to start beating, my hands are going to start sweating, I'm going to start breathing really heavily. But this time, my brain's going to have that physical sensation, and it's going to look around the environment, it's going to scan the environment, it's going to see Natalie Portman, and it's going to go, this is not fear, this is excitement. And instead of running away, I'll run towards her. And so there are these three major components of emotions, which is the physical sensation of the emotion, what we call the cognitive interpretation of it, which is just the thoughts that we have about that physical sensation, and then the behavior. So if we want to understand our emotions, we have to pay attention to all of these things. We have to pay attention to how we feel physically, to what we're thinking, and then to how we behave. So feelings give us insight into our emotions. And when I say feelings here, I mean physical sensations. We often use those words interchangeably in our day-to-day life. And that's because the physical sensation that accompanies emotions is such a meaningful part of it, right? But every emotion has a physical sensation. And I remember when my therapist asked me, she's like, how are you feeling? And I'm like, I'm very angry. And she's like, well, how do you know that? And I'm like, how do I know what? She's like, how do you know that you're angry? And that was the first time someone had posed that question to me. And she's like, what does it feel like? And then I began to focus on the feeling of anger, which is just this like tension, right? It's like squeezing all of my muscles, squeezing my jaw. It's this like heat coming off my face, coming off the top of my head, that there is actually a physical sensation that accompanies anger. And that is true of all emotions. And the more intense your emotion is, the more powerful that physical effect is too. Thoughts also give us insight into our emotions. So I'm going to brag here for a second. This is one of my favorite pictures of myself. I'm that tiny little dot in the middle of the picture that's at the beginning of a 1,800-foot rock climb. And as you can imagine, this is a pretty terrifying activity. And I would start getting scared about climbs like this, like 3 or 4 days before the actual climb. And I would start just having these little thoughts like, oh, what if this goes wrong? Or what if that goes wrong? And those little thoughts would turn into these kind of movies in my head of falling on rocks and like bone jutting out of my skin. And it was just all terrifying. And it's because I had this emotion which would bring up these fearful thoughts. And then, of course, those fearful thoughts stoke the emotion even more, which make the thoughts even more extreme. But the emotion is creating these thoughts in our head, is driving these thoughts in our head. So one way to know you're scared is that you're thinking scary thoughts. Lastly, our emotions influence our behaviors. I try to be a very calm, polite driver, and I think I am 90% of the time. But sometimes I'll notice that I'm like weaving in and out of traffic. I'm cutting people off. I'm like blowing through 4-way stops, just like rolling through them, just being a really aggressive driver. And I'll notice that behavior, and then I'll go, oh, I'm in a really bad mood. And like I wasn't aware of the emotional experience of being irritated or frustrated or stressed out, whatever it is. I wasn't aware of the emotional experience of that until I saw the impact on my behavior. So the behavior, how we're acting, can give us insight into how we're feeling. This is really complicated to do well. Our emotions are like this constant sense of mystery. We often struggle to understand why we're feeling what we're feeling. And there's a psychological study that I think shows this really well. They did a study where they made up some reason for the study. It was like a memory study or something. And they had college-aged boys come into the lab on campus and do the study, and they had a female research assistant. And after the study was over, they asked the college guys to rate the female research assistant on how attractive she was. And then they did the study again, except this time, instead of doing it on campus, they had the guys walk across this like rickety bridge that was way up in the air and kind of like a scary experience. And they rated the research assistant's attractiveness again. And as you might guess, the guys that had walked across the bridge rated the research assistant as more attractive. And the reason for that is because walking across that bridge, you get nervous, right? And so your heart starts beating, your breathing increases, your hands get sweaty, you get this kind of nervous excitement in a dangerous situation like that. When you get across the bridge and someone asks you, how attractive do you think this girl is? You look inside of yourself and you go, oh man, my heart's beating pretty quickly. I'm breathing kind of quickly. My hands are sweating. And that same physical experience of fear is essentially the experience you have when you're around someone you're attracted to. And so the guys would confuse the experience of fear for the experience of being attracted. And we do this all the time in our life, that we have this physical experience or this physical reaction to something, and we're unsure of where it's coming from, and we just have to take our best guess. Emotions are just complicated and difficult to understand in that way. All right, so we understand our emotions through the physical sensations associated with them, through the thoughts that they cause us to have, and then through our actions or behaviors. Now, occasionally you're going to get in a situation that is so emotionally powerful that all of these things just freeze up. They shut off. And sometimes you'll be in a discussion with someone, and at 1 minute you are so angry and you're just about to explode, and then instantaneously you kind of go numb and it feels like you're shut off. That's something called flooding, and that's something we're going to be that's really important to understanding self-awareness. It's also really important understanding how to effectively work with other people. Flooding is essentially, it's almost like a safety switch your brain has, where when your emotions become too powerful, too overwhelming, they just shut off completely. And you'll notice physically you have the feeling of being numb. As far as behavior goes, you'll just sit still, or you have this kind of like blank expression across your face, and then your thoughts will kind of just go dead too, and you can't even cognitively, you can't even engage with whatever the topic is anymore. And that's flooding. Flooding is when you are just so overwhelmed with emotions that you click off. So today we've talked about emotions and how they are powerful somatic experiences. We've differentiated emotions from traits, which are lifelong predispositions, and moods, which are lower intensity than emotions, but last a lot longer as well. We've talked about the impact of emotions and how to use those to understand our emotions better, so how emotions influence our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Lastly, we're going to talk about some common sources of emotions, which include people, places, situations, and substances. The people we interact with influence our emotions in powerful ways. I promise that when you see your mother's name pop up on your phone's caller ID, that you have an emotional reaction to that, right? It's probably the same emotional reaction you've been having since you were 15. But there are certain people that just being with them or interacting with them, it reliably causes or arouses a certain emotion in us. Places do this as well. We have places that influence our emotions. So this is a picture of Horsetooth Reservoir. This is right outside of where I went to grad school. And I spent so much time up here with my friends, just like hanging out in the sun, swimming, drinking beer. It was just such a happy place for me for, 5-6 years. And I went back to Colorado after I graduated, and I went back to this place, and it was like that feeling was still there. Like as soon as I stood there looking, I was just filled with a sense of like contentment and joy because I had so many positive memories associated with this place. So certain places elicit certain emotions with us as well. Certain situations influence emotions or arouse certain emotions in us. I absolutely hate getting my hair cut. And this is something I just realized about myself. I had like cut my own hair for like 10 years because I hated getting my hair cut so much. And I had told myself I was doing it to save money. But then when I could afford to get haircuts, I started getting haircuts, and I always put it off. And I just hate being stuck in a chair making awkward small talk, and I hate being like, you suck, this is not what I wanted, which inevitably happens. And so I just find that situation of getting my haircut arouses this like anxiety in me. A lot of people have this in regard to like giving feedback or evaluating other people, but it is the situation that reliably arouses a certain emotion in you. Substances have a strong influence on our emotions as well. Emotions are fundamentally a physical experience, and so anything we do that alters that physical chemistry in any way is going to influence our emotions as well. I think one of the most powerful examples of this is caffeine. Most of us drink caffeine without thinking twice about it. Caffeine is a very powerful drug, and if you doubt that, then I encourage you to not drink caffeine for 6 weeks and then drink your normal amount of caffeine, whatever you're drinking now, and you'll be like, oh, this has a powerful influence on me. Coffee is also a good example because sometimes we mistake the physiological impact of coffee for something else. So maybe you've had the experience of you drank too much coffee too quickly and you get really like jittery and like you get anxious and you're like, oh man, and you're worried about something and you're like, oh dude, this thing is going to be such a problem. This thing is going to be such a problem. And then like 2 hours later when the coffee's worn off and you're feeling yourself, you're like, oh, that thing's not that big a deal. And you were mistaking the physiological arousal, the heart rate, the jittery hands that the coffee had caused. You were mistaking that for an emotion. So that is how substances influence emotions. Another example is food. Food has a really powerful impact on our emotions. We all have been hangry at one point or another where we get in a really bad mood because we don't have enough blood sugar. Likewise, if you've ever had a huge meal, you often feel kind of lethargic and tired afterwards. So the food that we eat impacts our emotions as well. And finally, water. A lot of us do drink coffee all day, and by the end of the day, we have a headache and we're crabby, and it's probably because we're dehydrated. That coffee is a diuretic. You pee out all your water when you drink coffee, and so things like getting enough food, being hydrated, coffee, those can have a powerful influence on our emotional state. Today we talked about emotions, which are value-laden somatic experiences. We differentiated between emotions, traits, and moods. Emotions usually lasting about less than 5 minutes and being very intense. Traits, which are a lifelong predisposition to emotionally react in a certain way. And moods, which are less intense than emotions and can last hours, weeks, or even years. We talked about the impact of emotions and how emotions influence our thoughts, our physical sensations, our feelings, and our behaviors, and how by paying attention to our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, we can get insight into our emotions. And then finally, we talked about the sources of emotions, which include people, places, situations, and substances. So as you can see, there's a lot going on here trying to be self-aware, trying to understand our emotions. And it's actually much more complicated than this, right? It really looked like this, where all of these things are influencing all the other things. And it's not just these clean little arrows going in one direction. All of this is mixing into this emotional soup at any given time. And to make it even more difficult, all of this is going on within the context of culture, and culture has a huge, powerful influence on all of these things as well. And if we go back to the idea of self-awareness, where we have this limited amount of attention, there's this really complicated thing going on, and we can only zoom in and really be aware of it, one little tiny part of it. This is the goal, right? To make this little circle of awareness as large as possible, to get as much awareness or insight into that really complicated internal world as we can. That is our goal. So this is really complicated because this is what's going on with you at all points in time, all the time. And also when we get into effective social interaction and social regulation, this is going on with the other person as well. And you need to be aware of all of those things. And so you can quickly see how being emotionally aware and socially adept becomes incredibly complicated and difficult, and it requires a lot of practice.